Hello, welcome to this channel. As you've seen from the title, this video will be regarding my life experiences as a gay man in Ethiopia, or growing up gay in Ethiopia. The reason wanted to make this video, actually, I've made videos similar to this about 10 years ago when I was trying to do YouTube. So I had a channel actually dedicated to just sharing that experience. But I was fairly young at that time. I was about like 19, 20. I had some fear. Content like this is not easy to make, especially if you're dependent on family. If you're living within a community that might put your safety at risk. So I actually deleted those videos and that channel at that period. But it doesn't seem like a lot has changed since that time, where content like this or people coming out to speak about their life experiences hasn't really changed. Especially on YouTube, you don't really find a lot of this type of material. So I thought, hey, why not? I'm a 30-year-old man. I don't have a whole lot to lose if anything was to go bad, but I am I am at a point in my life where I am fully dependent on myself. So I can share my experiences and share that side of myself without fearing repercussions from those I might be dependent on. Just a disclaimer, I have a note over here which I will reference to back and forth. This does not cover anything, so I don't know how long this video will be. Probably half an hour, 20 minutes or so. But I lived in Ethiopia from birth to when I was 20. I left around when I was 19, 20. So obviously, a video this long is not going to cover a lot of things. So there will be some holes in my stories, just because there isn't enough time. So I don't necessarily want people to fill in their own ideas or assumptions. I want people to remember that this does not cover someone's full life story, especially when it comes to a complex topic as homosexuality in that part of the world. And obviously, I have excluded a few things that might invade people's privacies. For one, not everyone is in a place like me, so I don't want to necessarily share certain things that might be tied to individuals who might still be living in Ethiopia. So just an FYI, I'm not living in Ethiopia, so that is also a privilege for me in the sense that I can speak about these things without putting myself at risk. So I don't want to invade anyone's privacy by mentioning certain things. So I'm going to avoid certain topics, certain aspects of my life. By doing this video, I'm not claiming any community. Obviously, this video is in English, and that's for a reason. I don't necessarily want to make it in Amharic, which is the Ethiopian national language, just because it's not meant for. I'm not trying to convince any like homophobic Ethiopian or just your everyday Ethiopian. I want this to be a material for anyone who might be, curious, whoever's in the diaspora, just someone researching this topic, someone, just curious about this. Because my previous times, I made these videos for that audience specifically, and I've learned that it's just futile trying to convince people, trying to correct them, it's always your opinion against mine sort of way. And at this day and age, if someone thinks that I'm wearing diapers, it's not necessarily my place to correct them. They have access to the internet, they have access to a whole broad, a full library of research, so they can obviously do that if they're interested. So this video is not about activism. It's not about claiming my Ethiopianness and trying to change the politics there. It's far from it. If I can distance myself from that as much as possible, I will be happy to do that. So just a disclaimer, obviously the title will have the term Ethiopia because that's where I was born. I didn't necessarily have a choice for about that. So it's just my life experience. Um, and it's not a Q&A. Obviously, I'm not going to go back and, trying to answer questions that people have asked me in the past, just certain things that at this point, for me at least, they seem silly. But people might generally be curious about those things, but I just don't have the time to do that right now, or trying to shift someone's opinion. So that is my 5 minute and 40 seconds of disclaimer. Um, so just a background information about myself. I think I have background next. I've mentioned I am a 30-year-old man. I currently live in the US and reside in the US. And that is an important aspect to mention because that has enabled me to have some sort of individuality in the sense that I'm financially independent from family. So that also ties into, having grown up at a country that is quite homophobic. It wasn't until I think later in life that I've not necessarily come in terms with it, but been open with it. So a background about myself: I grew up in a family that was modestly large. I had one sister and 6 brothers. I was the youngest of all, but my parents sort of had previous relationships before coming together. So me and my brother were the last two, but also the two two of us were from the same parents, right? Like mother and father is similar. So I had a bunch of half brothers in that sense. I grew up for the most time, for most of my life, I would say I grew up with my mom. My mom and dad did not live together. It's just their arrangement. Like I mentioned, they came from a previous relationship. My mom was a widow. My dad was a divorced person. Um, so they just decided to raise their sides of the family separately. So I ended up with my mother, and my brother ended up with my father. And I want to mention, like, I had talked about me being the youngest child, and it wasn't until later on that I learned actually that younger brothers often, especially in a family of sons, tend to be homosexual. There's more likeliness that they would turn out to be gay, which later on, after I learned that, I was like, okay, that makes sense. But I was the youngest by 5 years, so from my oldest brother. I was educated in Ethiopia for the most part, not until university. So most of my education, most of my understanding about life and all that, ties into the Ethiopian culture, Ethiopian society, with some, I would say, Western influence that cannot be avoided, obviously. So that's sort of a broad background about myself. I grew up in Addis Ababa. I forgot to mention that also ties into certain things. I grew up in lower middle class, I would say, family. My mom was a working woman, and my dad sort of retired because of health reasons. But I grew up in a family that, I wasn't deprived of anything financially. My parents were very education focused, especially because my mom was a businesswoman. She didn't necessarily want that life for her children. So we were always pushed to, especially me and my brother, were always pushed to excel in academically, which I wasn't necessarily the best. So let me just jump back to, I have it set up in like sort of years of spans of 5 years. I don't know if that's the best way to do this, but so from birth until year 5, I would say until I was 5 years old, I was in Addis. I was growing up with my mom. My mom was, yes, I was growing up with her, but she wasn't at home most of the time because, like I mentioned, she had her own business. If you were someone who has ever had any business, you know how much time it consumes. And for the most part of my life, I remember her working 16-hour days. Just she basically lived at her workplace. So she was a hardworking woman who tried to provide everything for her children and herself. Independence, especially in Ethiopian society, for women to be employed while the husband is retired is quite unusual. So in that sense, my family was the different. Um, Growing up, I mean pre-K and stuff, I don't remember that much. I don't feel like I was quite different. I was actually a fun, lovable kid. At least from the pictures, it seemed like I had a lot of friends. I had a lot of birthdays. I didn't feel different in any way. Especially like I have certain physical insecurities, my forehead being one. I was quite bullied by about that. I will mention it later on, but even that did not really take effect until later on. So I think 0 to 5 years old, I was a very lovable child. I feel like nothing was quite out of the ordinary. I grew up a normal childhood. Maybe not necessarily too normal because there wasn't really an everyday parent care guidance. My mom was, like I mentioned, working, so I was with the house helps most of the time. I can go and play with my friends. So it wasn't necessarily very restricted. Education wise, again, I wasn't the smartest at that period. Even later on, from ages 5 to 10, which I'll jump right into. Um, Nothing like I went to Miss Kazunan. If anyone has ever been around Sidiskilo, that's a church-based school. So that was my start into education, Miss Kazunan High School. At that time, I would say I was a bit different, like maybe age 7 or so. I wasn't necessarily interested in a lot of the games that the boys were interested in. I remember playing with, I had mostly male friends at school. Granted, my closest friend at home was a girl, but like most of my friends at school were guys, and I remember playing like some stupid games that they played. But I wasn't necessarily your soccer loving. I don't know, like fighting type of child at that period. Granted, I went to a Christian school, so people were more or less moderate at that point. Children weren't necessarily rowdy or anything. But I would say I was a bit feminine in that regard. No one really mentioned it. I think still I was at that age where I was excused. Like it wasn't necessarily out of the ordinary, right? Like I haven't hit puberty, so if my voice was a bit feminine, no one was like, "Oh, look at your voice," whatever. My interest, maybe I got picked on, because of that. Like maybe I was more into myself, or maybe I didn't want to play because I was insecure about playing soccer because I didn't feel like I knew how I could play well. Uh, I avoided fights. I avoided any physical altercation, right? Um, but I wouldn't say anything memorable out of the ordinary happened at that age. Um, I had a normal childhood, I would say, in that regard. Those were from ages 1 to 10 were, I would say, the best years of my life. At home, especially, I remember quite memorable um, times with childhood friends, and I would say maybe later on, like in age 9, age 10 or so, is also when and this topic is a bit taboo for people, but I think I was aware of my sexual being. in that regard. Like, I haven't necessarily hit puberty, but I I had feelings, right? I had certain feelings. Maybe later on, and maybe at 9 10 or so. So I remember certain instances where me and someone my age, we would play around in that regard, like sexually, maybe whatever, kissing and those were boys my age, which later on um, would identify themselves as straight. Not necessarily that I have confronted them, but some of them were even um, like open about their homophobia. But at that age, I would say I wouldn't I mean it's not out of the ordinary for boys to do those things. I feel like at that age, with their own peer mates. So I had that phase in that regard. I kissed boys. Not that I understood much about what homosexuality was, if me doing that was out of the ordinary or frowned upon by society. I didn't even understand sex, but and I wouldn't say I was forced or anything. It was just natural. We would maybe be playing, and then it was just like, oh, let's try this kind of thing. I wasn't necessarily molested. I wasn't forced into anything. It was two boys the same age, just doing things, or just doing something that they felt was part of playing, I guess. um, but that was my first instance of sort of understanding. Like, I didn't necessarily have that feeling towards the girls, like I mentioned. Back home I had a female friend, but I didn't necessarily want to do those things with her. um, I had wanted to do those things with my boyfriends, or like the guy friends that I had who were my age. I have to emphasize that they were my age. No one molested me or anything. Um, but I didn't have those feelings. But again, like I mentioned, I didn't put two and two together. I was still young. I didn't understand it. From age 10 to 15 was, I would say, um, my worst years, of the worst years of my childhood. I would say from until 10 years old was when I had my innocence. I had a certain semblance of freedom. My family dynamics changed at age about 11. Before then, I wasn't really close with my brother, who was my full brother. He would visit on summers, but I hated it. Like, he was very strict. He was my dad, more or less. My dad is quite strict, so he wasn't like, we didn't get along. He was 5 years older than me, so maybe that would make sense. But we didn't have fun. It was just like, I don't remember enjoying it. But I did have another older half brother who also lived with my mom, and that sort of dispels the myth that growing up with your mom is what leads to homosexuality, because he spent all of his life, because his dad passed away. He spent his life with our mom, but he's straight as they can come, if you understand what I mean. So but even with him, he was much older than me, so we didn't get along. So brothers, I didn't have much influence with my brothers. So I was more or less a friend type of individual, and more or less secluded in my own ways. Just I was, I was on my own a lot at the time. So, but at age 11, my mom left to go abroad. So that meant that I had to go live with my father. My dad is a very strict individual. He did not work, he was retired. So that meant that he was fully hands on. So that meant I had my books checked every day, every time I came from school. So everything was checked. Before then, I maybe ranked, last of the class. Like, my grades were not good, like average C type of kid. But because my dad was very full on, he tutored me. he was very punitive. Like I mentioned, maybe I was 30 years old now. So at that time was, still early 2000s. So I guess parenting, especially in Ethiopia, in that part of the world, in Ethiopia, was a bit different. So I remember being punished, which didn't, my mom did not punish me in that regard. So that all that was new to me. I was this outgoing kid, very, very sociable, who wanted to play. I didn't care that much about grades, but once I started living with my dad, I was sort of beaten to a certain mold, which I would say sort of shaped the remaining of my life. It made me a very secluded individual. My dad did not allow, that kind of like playing around. I wasn't really allowed to go out and just, play as much as I wanted. He wasn't really, there wasn't much love coming from him. He already had raised a lot of kids from his previous relationship. He was older. I had an older father as well, so I get the sense that he was tired. And again, the dynamics of parenting in that part of the world, it wasn't at that time, at least for my family, it wasn't much lovey-lovey, especially for fathers. It was more, when I come to the house, you have to stand up, greet me, kind of thing. If you don't listen, or if you don't do what I ask, you'll get punished. If you don't answer this question, and if you miss a certain test, you'll get punished. I remember when he was tutoring me, he was teaching me division, all those basic things, maybe, which I should have learned. He was very punitive. So my relationship with my father, I wouldn't say was the best. But I had to live with him even after my mom came back. I had to live with him for the remainder of like a few more years, just because my grades went up with his supervision. My grades went up, so they made a deal. It's like, okay, he's doing better with me, so I will take care of him. So my dad made that arrangement. The living situations also wasn't that the best because my dad didn't work. He lived in a government house. So I had to share a lot of things. So I didn't have that, especially at that age of puberty. I didn't have that freedom to venture out and just that age, where your head is. But I won't get into certain details, but I would say the age 11 has really impacted me because I endured a lot of abuse from certain family members as well, but nothing sexual. It was mostly psychological and physical abuse. So that really put me into a shell. And a lot of people, even at that age, a lot of people who knew me before 10 would, when they meet me later on, they would expect, the open type of kid. And they would be amazed how in 2 years I sort of like transformed into this quiet boy who didn't want to engage, who was very antisocial, who was very insecure about himself. So I sort of became that person who sort of transitioned into life, and it's something I'm still dealing with, and a lot of the impact of those ages still lives on with me. But sexuality wise, I didn't have much access to anything at that point. I didn't have any close friendships. School was very close, but it was very small. It was a small school that I was put into, so I didn't really have a lot of friends. I had a few friends, but we didn't. School time is quite short. Maybe in recess we would play, but they couldn't come to my house. I couldn't go to theirs. We didn't have neighbors who were my age, so it was very hard. But I would say at that age, I think at this normal age, especially for people find other means, other access. So I would remember later on, I was more exposed to movies. Obviously, my understanding of English has also changed. I could watch a movie and I could understand it in a lot of ways. So there are moments where I sort of saw myself in certain movies where whether it be that I would notice myself being a bit interested in the male character, maybe during sex scenes or whatever, than the female character. And also, there were some gay characters even at that time, even though, it would be for a short span, but I would understand those things. I'll be like, okay, that sort of resembles me. That would be an age maybe 13, 14. What else? School was like that. I changed school, I would say, around 12. I went to another Christian school called Raguel. If you're around the Mercato area in Addis, you would know where that school is. So, except for 2 years in my academic life, most of my school years were spent in Christian schools, learning the Bible. These were schools that taught you the Bible, taught you Giz, which is the old language of the Bible. They taught you ethics and stuff. So there were certain chapters or so that talked about sexuality, which I recognized. I would say that's when I learned about the hate towards such feelings, or people with such feelings or such views. So the word for it is Gibre Sodom in Ethiopia. So, if you learn the Bible, there are certain chapters about Sodom and Gomorrah and stuff, which reference to people having, whatever, same sex. Again, it's open to interpretation. I'm not here to do that, but at that point, when you're learning it in school, it's referenced in that regard. So I knew I had to hide whatever I'm feeling, and that it's not necessarily accepted. That was also an age where again, this is like 13, 14. If you grew up in Ethiopia, you would know that you can rent any movie, right? So that was also the time when I was exposed to porn, I would say, or I was interested in porn. I would go to the box office, our version of box office, and I would be like, hey, my brother sent me to rent an erotic movie. And again, it's that age of curiosity. Again, I know at this point in at this day and age, it's illegal. You're not supposed to do that again. I feel like we've all done it. But I was just curious, and I would rent those movies. We transitioned, my dad, because he wasn't really the richest person, we transitioned from VHS, or no, we transitioned from black and white TV to all the way to a CD player or DVD player. So there were certain phases of where we would be watching VHS movies, and I would rent those types of movies in VHS, to when they transitioned into CDs, DVDs. Those became more accessible, and I would watch them. And I was more interested in the guy, and it wasn't anything to deny. Unfortunately, of course, all the types of movies that you watch are Caucasians, right? They're white men, they're white women. So in a lot of ways, I don't know, I guess my mind didn't necessarily care about race. But also I had a sort of unrealistic expectation, because again, those movies are not, those guys, those white, big built guys are not necessarily the guys that I would see in my day-to-day life in Ethiopia, obviously. So I think part of me also developed some sort of a niche attraction that could only be fulfilled by, renting new movies and sort of like finding new scenes, new videos and stuff. So in that sense, it was quite harmful for me to do that. But I feel like it's a normal stage for a lot of boys, even at this age, especially with internet. So, but yet again, also, I explored. This age, I would say 10 to 15 was when I was quite very like private. I did things on my own. I thought about things a lot on my own. I came into terms a lot of things. It was, again, I mentioned my abuse, what I went through. So that was an age of me wanting to leave home, me wanting to run away, a lot of self harm, a lot of bodily injury. Um, and eventually, once that abuse stopped, um, I sort of transitioned into this quiet boy who didn't get along with, unfortunately, with his any of his brothers, um, and just kept to myself, trying to survive every day, especially living in that situation with my other siblings. It wasn't necessarily the easiest thing for me, um, but luckily at I believe age 14 or so, there was an opportunity for me to wait. Was it 14? I think it was later. Wait, there was, yeah, later. I think I was about 15 when I went back to my mom to live with my mom. So I spent a good amount of time with living with my dad. That shaped me in the sense, like I mentioned, made me more academically inclined. I learned quite a bit. My grades were, I was focused on school. And that helped me immensely, even to give me this freedom to be anywhere, to go to whatever I want, and to go and do whatever I wanted to do. So it helped me quite a bit. So that age shaped me in that regard. Um, I didn't necessarily have any relationships, even within that 10, like 15, 14 range. I didn't necessarily have someone where I was secretly meeting every day, someone my age or anything. I was very closed in. I Most of my interests in school, most of my friends were females. I remember being so schools in Ethiopia, especially maybe this speaks for a religious school, you don't really encounter a lot of physical bullying, at least from what I've seen in the West, where you might physically be shoved in places, punched or whatever. Doesn't necessarily happen, or it didn't necessarily happen to me. But I was known to be very feminine. Um, I was the feminine guy. A lot of my friends were female. I got along with girls quite very easy. Uh, to a point where the guys would be like, "What the fuck? Why? How is he hanging out with her and stuff?" Um, but I got picked on for being quite feminine. Whatever, maybe seit, which means girly. I would be called names. At this point of my life, I don't really remember. But at the same time, I still had some male friends, but we weren't very close. Like, I had one friend who stuck with me quite a while. He started off being my bully, funny enough. But after 2 weeks or so, we got along, and that was like in grade 6. But we remained friends for quite a while. We spent recess together most of the time, but it wasn't until later on, I think about like age 16 and stuff, he just ventured out and found another friend. But I had some close friends who I even took home. We spent time. I went to their house. They didn't necessarily judge me in that regard. Like, for example, this one friend I was talking about, he wasn't constantly telling me to appear masculine or anything like that. We just enjoyed having fun, going to the house, going to the shop, cutting class, and going to the cinema. But we didn't do anything sexual. That's the thing. Even I had a couple of other male friends. there was nothing sexual about our relationship. It was more us just being friends. Um, I would say later on, I gravitated more towards girl, even more. I would say, I think because maybe I myself was a bit insecure to be around boys for the whole day or whatever, because that would maybe involve playing certain games, certain sports, talking about girls. And I remember there was even an age or a point in my life where I would pretend. I would chime in about talking about girls because 14, 15-year-old boys, they would talk about females in school. They would talk about sex, they would talk about those things, and I just chimed in as someone who was interested in girls. One main thing that happened, I would say, even at that point, would be the internet. It became more accessible. Um, that you can go to an internet cafe. I remember there was a mall. I don't know if it's a mall, a shopping center called Tana. If you're in Mercato, you would know it. But there was an internet cafe on the second floor, and I don't know how I saved up money. Sometimes I would just walk certain distances, try to save money from transportation, or I would just find money somehow. But I would go to the internet and just Google gay, or I don't know, just, and at that time I had no, like, my knowledge about computers was very low, so it wasn't like I was cleaning up my history, my browsing history or anything. I would just go there, like, try to find a corner, and I think I was just basically watching or like looking at pictures of gay men, like, naked men, I guess. But I would still, look at the topic. I had an email address. I think there were Yahoo groups at that point as well, Yahoo Q&A. So I would research those topics. There were certain chat groups, I believe, as well. I've transitioned technology-wise. I've come a long way, So I remember at that time, I had, I think, maybe a YMail or something. So I would go into chat rooms and, speak to people. I don't know if I necessarily met any gay, like openly gay men on those groups, but I might have. But this leads me into 15 to 20, which is actually when I was more in tuned with myself. I had more understanding. I would say even that time of age, there were more exposure of gay people. Even with the censorship that existed in Ethiopia, like if you had a satellite dish, which is quite common in Ethiopia, it comes from Egypt, I believe. Some of the channels, like the NBC channels, the Fox series and stuff, they had some TV shows. Like my favorite was Glee, Ugly Betty. I remember loving Nip Tuck. What else? Those were like the series shows where I followed the lives of certain people that are gay characters that I felt, talked to me, spoke to my experiences. So I saw myself a lot within that period, I would say from ages 15 to 20. I saw myself quite a bit in the outside world. Part of that might also be because I was exposed to those things more, whether it be because now like I was the only person in the house, like with my mom, living with my mom, not necessarily the only person, but I had more access. I was older, no one could push me around. I can just go to the box office and rent something, or later on when we got the satellite dish, I can just watch TV shows. I can go to I had a phone where I had access to internet, where I could chat to other gay Ethiopians on certain like channels or like certain apps. I don't remember what apps, but I had a Nokia where I was able to do that. But also Facebook came around. Facebook was, I think, a game changer, and it still is in that part of the world, because it's especially within the community of, I don't want to generalize LGBTQ or anything, but within the gay Ethiopian community, people met each other and, were more involved on the Facebook scene. Again, they were in the background. They hid behind, including myself, fake profiles, fake pictures, and all of that. So, you would meet someone with some random movie character as their profile picture, and they don't have any pictures with themselves. So you would talk to them, you would chat with them, and eventually, once you gain their trust, they trust you, and you trust them. You can exchange pictures. Later on, you can meet each other. But even at that age, I was more, I was more or less insecure. I was very, very much a homebody. That was also I would say, at the time, even though I was living with my mom was a bit hands-on. She was the type of mother. Even though she was in the home, she would call 10 times a day on the house phone, because we had house phones, to make sure I was home and studying or whatever. So it wasn't necessarily that I had free Wi-Fi or anything. If I wanted to use the internet, I had to go out. If I wanted to meet someone, I had to go out. So I didn't do any of those things until later on. I would say until like 18, 19, college years, where I had a bit more freedom. But school-wise, I had, especially grade 10, 11, or 11, 12 or so, I had sort of a balance. Not like the closest friends I had, I would say, were still girls. I sat with them and stuff. But I was still a bit, weirdly enough, close to certain boys where they didn't care about physical contact and stuff. Again, they were straighter and stuff, but they were secure enough not necessarily to be weirded out about smacking the ass of the feminine boy or the feminine guy in class or anything like that. We were very, they were very chill. There was a point where I sat with 3 other guys in one desk. We had fun, we enjoyed it and stuff, but we didn't necessarily, our friendship didn't go out of that classroom, if you understand what I mean. So I don't know if they were like necessarily, I don't know, I can't necessarily call them close friends, but I wasn't necessarily picked on by them. They would mention certain things about, like, let's say, they would talk about gay porn in front of me. I didn't, I was like, and again, at that point, I wasn't necessarily chiming in, talking about girls, talking about pussy. But, I didn't deny anything, but I kept in the corner. I didn't really say anything. And so I'd be like, oh, you watched gay porn. They'll tell me, oh, yeah, they had sex like this and stuff. I'm like, okay, I don't know why you're telling me. Are you trying to say something? But, oh, yeah. A lot of the times, along with, I would say, the dominant part of me being bullied was, again, I've mentioned this, my forehead. this big old thing. I used to be picked on by it so many times. Like, I've heard all types of names. So, like, most of the bullying, my insecurity also came from like physically, not necessarily just me being feminine, but also just didn't want to be picked on because of my forehead. Something I cannot change. PE classes were the worst. There were certain weird moments where I remember this one particular guy. I think was it in like one senior year in high school, who was a bit like, all of a sudden he was the biggest guy, like he was this bodybuilder, big guy at our class. But all of a sudden he was interested in me. Like, he would be so nice to me. I mean, we didn't hang out or anything, I knew him in class, and certain, like, there was this class called TD, technical drawing. So I would sell I would sell copies of my I would do multiple of those, like, homeworks, and I would sell them, and I used to sell it to him. So most of our contact came from that. Like, I would sell him the homework, and I would use the money to rent a movie or whatever, or use the internet. Um, but eventually, like, he was very close. He was very nice to me. But I wasn't really attracted to him. Like I mentioned, like he was very big, like like this big built guy, and it wasn't necessarily my type. I had a crush on a lot of boys in school, but obviously none of them talked to me. But yeah, he was very like. Eventually, he talked about like gay sex and how he would want to spend graduation night with me and his friends and stuff. It was like, I remember just walking away from that situation, and I would say that's like the only time I can recall someone coming on to me in that sense. I didn't necessarily have, someone just secretly pass me a note in school. No one was trying to ask me out, obviously, or tell me their story in secret. How like, because people knew I was feminine, but they didn't necessarily label it as homosexuality, right? Like there would be certain chapters in biology where surprisingly enough, they would teach us about hormonal imbalance and how certain men will have breasts and because they might have higher testosterone, so they would also have a pitched voice. And I tell you, like, when that was said, I think that happened in like a couple of grades. Like almost the whole classroom would turn around and look at me. So part of me feels like people thought maybe, oh, he's just feminine because of hormonal imbalance. And if you can see my hairline, I mean, I don't think I'm deficient in testosterone levels, but I think it was more or less perceived in that regard that those who are feminine are just they're not. It's not gayness, but it's just maybe I don't know. Maybe they have a lot of sisters. I think that's one thing I usually got. Like I would be asked, "Do you have a lot of sisters?" Or just hormone imbalance. Um, yeah, and at home, I would hear certain like from neighbors and certain individuals, they try to tell you certain stories about homosexuals having worms in their ass and like worms coming out and just some horror stories. So again, at that point in my life, I was exposed to like what the idea was that it's just me. There's nothing I can change whatever I try. I've known about people who did try to change themselves, suicide, whatever, what a conversion therapy. Like I think I was more very in tune because I didn't go out that much, and I was very much a loner. I spent my time on those things. So I think that gave me a better understanding of myself, and I was able to accept myself very early on. But that didn't necessarily translate into coming out and just saying, "Hey, I'm gay, mom and dad." I know one person who did that. I don't know where they are now, but I was still also, I don't know. I don't want to call it smart enough, but I was aware that there would be consequences if I did that. As much as I wanted to, as much as I wanted to replicate the life that I saw on certain characters and just live my truth, all that, lines, all those cliches that I feel like they are. But I couldn't do it. But I was more or less, I was active on Facebook. I would post. So that was also one of my outlets. I would post about sexuality stuff. I would talk to people even though I wouldn't meet them personally until later on. Um, yeah, I sort of whatever I missed out on like in person contact with other people like me, I sort of made up on social media, and in the safety of whatever my home or the internet cafe. Um, I don't want to necessarily get into certain details about family, but there was issues in that regard as well. Some brothers who didn't necessarily like how I behaved. Again, I wasn't a bad kid, I did a few bad things, but I was in I was a good kid. I was the type who washed his mother's feet and who cooked for his mom. I wasn't necessarily a rebel, but again, those interests are not necessarily labeled as such. Like for boys, I love to cook, I love to clean. I love, just like the weird things, and I just sit down and watch a movie all day. But when certain brothers didn't enjoy that, they didn't like that I was feminine, and I think they were, the neighborhood, maybe other kids would, say certain things to them, so they wouldn't feel. So I've been called a few things by certain brothers, but nothing necessarily physical for that purpose. I didn't have any brother who punched me because I was too feminine or anything like that. With that being said, though, I don't feel like I had, fully embracing home life. It was more toleration, if anything. Um, and I didn't know anyone in my family who was different in that regard. Maybe they weren't out, but I could pick up on it. I didn't have anyone like that, so I couldn't really be open with anyone. I came out to, I would say, one friend. And that person was very open, like, more or less supportive. Like, you're my friend, it's okay. Yeah, later on, I would say, once I went to college, I did college in Ethiopia for about a short period. But before that, I believe it's before that or after, I don't remember. But I was a bit more active on Facebook. I met one person. Now, I actually met a bunch of people, but I didn't really do it for the sex. And I think I had, part of it might have been also my insecurity, but also me being picky about men. Like whoever I met, like I would usually, like, it would be like we would chat. I'm like, okay, let's meet at a cafe here, and I would go there, but I would be like, oh, this guy is not, he's not masculine enough, or he's not like this, or this, and I don't think they were interested in me either at that point. I was like this crony, 19-year-old who didn't really have much. I didn't have anything actually. But I wasn't really physically fit or attractive in that sense. So, but I met different characters. I met different people. I usually just listened to their stories. Not a lot of them liked it as well. That I would keep asking them certain things. So because within this community there is a certain sense of fear, especially in Ethiopia, because there are certain individuals who make this fake accounts to sort of catfish gay people into maybe blackmailing them or physically assaulting them after meeting them. So there was some sort of reservation on certain people, but that was probably the only time in Ethiopia that I actively met, and I met so many different types of guys, from bisexuals to people who are getting ready to get married, or like they were being forced to get married by family. Just a bunch of, I think a total, maybe I met like 15, 16 guys. Only with one that I did anything. But the rest, I just enjoy speaking with them, and some of them do get surprised even later in life. When I meet a man and just speak to them and just leave, and that's it. So I think the community in itself as well, unfortunately, we've sort of, or at that time has sort of subscribed to those stereotypes that gay men are promiscuous and stuff, because a lot of people went on Facebook things not because they were so eager to learn about themselves or to meet other gay men, but rather just for sex, for one night stand or whatever. They had lives. They had it with maybe they were married to women. They were not out, so they didn't want to actually admit they were gay. They just wanted to fulfill that physical aspect and just leave. So there was a lot of that in that community. Because I remember, like, the first thing you get asked when you chat with a gay person on those Facebook channels, and it used to annoy me, or Facebook groups, or Facebook friends that you've randomly added, is, are you a top or bottom? It's just like the first, some of them we wouldn't even say hello to you. It's like top or bottom. If you're bottom or if you're top and it's not compatible, they would just block you or just remove you. So in a lot of ways, I didn't really find support, and I regret that I did not become that support to anyone else in Ethiopia. And like I said, I'm 30. I can't really say I've helped one individual, one gay Ethiopian, sort of understand themselves, unfortunately. At that point, I didn't find that from other gay Ethiopians as well. Maybe part of that might have been my fault because I was very much a loner. My experience as a gay man in Ethiopia does not represent what the life of a lot of those people in the community had. Some were very open. I was very envious of them. That you would see them posting themselves in, like, they wouldn't put their face, but they would just parties that they had with other gay men, like gatherings, whatever fun they had. You would see those posts. I'm like, oh, I wish I was that open. I wish I was living my truth in that regard. But also, there were people who had it way worse than me as well. They were just not ready to acknowledge it and didn't want anything to do with it. So again, my life did not represent it. But there were those who did have those lives and who had that support and social system, or the social support. But I was just too insecure about myself. I was still, I think, dealing with, again, I didn't really call it depression at that time. I didn't understand what depression was, but I was the type who just wanted to be by myself. And I'm sure a lot of it had to do with like earlier life experiences. But this video is already an hour. I wish I could go on and talk about the rest of my other things and stuff, but I think that's enough for now. Thank you for watching.